On this trip, my favorite town of all was Concord, Massachusetts. Concord struck me as having the same flavor as, say, Petoskey or Boyne City, a tourist destination that has kept its integrity as a livable town. Concord is rich with history. There is an important building or a historical site on nearly every street, but in contrast to Salem and Plymouth, Concord has not abandoned itself to the temptation of overcapitalizing on its past and commercializing itself to death. Concord is a town comfortable enough with itself as a center of history so as not to feel that it has to brag about that history. It's just not gauche about it. Perhaps the most important historical site in Concord is the Old North Bridge, which spans the Concord River and is the site of one of the earliest battles of the Revolutionary War. Without Concord, who knows? We might not have had an America. Then, what would we have studied in this class? On the morning of April 19, 1775, American Minutemen engaged British troops in nearby Lexington. Outnumbered, the militia fell back, but the battle was not over. Hours later, about 400 Minutemen from Concord and surrounding towns made their stand at the North Bridge. The British, who had just retreated over the bridge, fired upon the Minutemen, who were advancing across it. After 6 Minutemen were hit, Major John Buttrick, their commander, yelled, "Fire! For God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire!" The Minutemen opened fire and killed several of the British. The British forces, outnumbered about 4 to 1, retreated. This stands as the first victory of the Revolutionary War. Ralph Waldo Emerson, an important Concordian whom we'll examine in a minute, wrote a poem about it. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, Emerson writes, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. The town of Concord could be said to have started and ended here in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. At least, its citizens tended to end here. On this hill, Concord settlers built their first meeting house and dwellings. Below it, they laid out their first road. And, of course, they were buried here. Notable tenants include Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne, but I was most struck by the many graves of children. Again and again, as I walked the sylvan paths of the cemetery, I was confronted with small headstones carved frequently with stylized children or memento mori, testimony to the harshness and uncertainty of life in the colonial period. Family after family lost multiple children, and on the headstones, the struggle to understand such a loss is writ vividly. One reads, "A hapless, tender little babe, so soon to sink in death's cold shade, but hush complaints and cease to grieve. The sleeping babe will rise and live." Things had improved somewhat by Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne's time, but I can't help but wonder if the omnipresence of death might not have had some part in driving each man to examine the meaning of life and one's purpose in the universe. Ralph Waldo Emerson can be seen as the father of Transcendentalism, a literary and intellectual movement which, Vernon Parrington writes in The Romantic Revolution in America, was a glorification of consciousness and will. Parrington asserts that the Transcendentalists pronounced human nature divine, endowed it with great potentialities, made of it a dwelling place of the Most High, discovered the secret voice of God in the buried life that men call instinct, and refused to heed any other command save this inner voice of God. This reliance on self as the absolute arbiter of choice and morality tended to lead the Transcendentalists afoul of both secular and religious laws and practices. Thoreau spent a night in jail for refusing to pay his poll tax, for example, and in Emerson's famous address at the Harvard Divinity School, he blasted church practices and asserted that while Jesus was a truly admirable man and one who understood the divinity of humanity, he shouldn't be seen as the Son of God any more than you or I should. But the Transcendentalists weren't easily brushed off. Emerson, for instance, was such an incredible thinker, writer, and orator that he was impossible to ignore. Unfortunately, I found his house to be less than impressive. It was quite nice, of course, and I did get a thrill thinking that it may have been from one of these windows that he gazed as he wrote, "These roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time to them. There is simply the rose." But man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or, heedless of the riches that surround him, stands on tiptoe to foresee the future. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present, above time. I looked in vain for a rose bush, but its absence didn't lessen the excitement I felt at standing near where the great man had had these thoughts. In the essay Personality and Style in Concord, Albert Gilman and Roger Brown describe Emerson as a great synthesizer, as one who was able to apprehend patterns in everything. In Literature in America, Don Hausdorff writes that Emerson emphasized and popularized a respect for intellect and the humanistic legacy, awareness of cultural movements, reverence for nature, and an abiding belief in the power of optimism and progress. And, Hausdorff writes, Emerson distrusted formal groups which he saw as inevitably leading to the dilution of individual belief and surrender to the pressures of convention. We can see all these traits in Self-Reliance, in which Emerson masterfully draws nature, God, society, and history into his argument that truth is found within oneself. As he writes, "Trust thyself. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." He nods to progress and humanity's innate divinity when he writes that we are guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and dark. As for what leads us, Emerson names the essence of genius, of virtue, and of life, which we call spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, while all later teachings are tuitions. Now, of course, there are problems with this philosophy, stirring as it is. What if one's innermost impulses are suspect? As Hausdorff writes, when Emerson said, "Trust thyself," both abolitionist and slave owner could concur heartily. And I think that when one follows Emerson's distrust of societies to its conclusion, one runs into problems. Must all societies be avoided? Must all compromise be considered selling out? To me, that smacks of the ill-considered idealism of the young anarchist. If we all turn on, tune in, and drop out, what happens to the roads? How about the police, or the hospitals and emergency workers? What about all the many, many ways membership in society can actually benefit us? Still, I find Emerson stirring. When I think about that common question of which great historical figure I'd like to have dinner with, he's one of the guys.